That's fine. There you go. Hi, everybody. We're going to go through the buyer's representation agreement. This is for anybody who wants to have a little bit of guidance on how to explain this to your clients. And let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my, here we go. Hi, so we're going to go through the buyer representation agreement. So just follow along. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all. If I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Oh, it looks like we are already. No, we're not. Okay, so there I'm sharing my screen. We're just going to go through this real quickly. So we start out by, like a lot of the form packets we have a form packet. So when you put the buyer representation agreement into your zip forms file, it's going to be a form packet. It won't be just that form. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this one, the disclosure regarding real estate relationship. And so just get past that one. And then, of course, we have our fair housing and dispute as well. We're just going to go on by that one. Then, of course, your possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Past that one. And your wiring. I swear, it looks like we've added so many new forms, but here we are, finally, buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So you have, I'm going to use Rachel as an example. So Rachel has a land listing. It's in 29 Palms, and she will likely be contacted by buyers because with land, it's very common for the buyers to reach out directly to the listing agent. And she will likely end up doing a dual agency. So the first thing that she's going to do is let the buyer know, look, I would love to work with you. However, we do need to sign an agreement that outlines the terms and conditions under which we will work. That should not be a surprise to anyone because even if you're just, I don't know, getting an app on your phone, you're signing an agreement. So this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that you want to have an agreement between the two of you, just to, be clear on what the terms and conditions are. So starting with number one, this is the representation period. So the buyer's representation agreement cannot be longer than 3 months. So we're going to put, if you filled out the summary and the parties in your zip forms, then this will auto populate. If you haven't, then you're going to put your buyers right here. You're going to put your broker right here. The beginning date will be the date that you're completing this agreement. So it's today's date and ending, and it gives you a number of days. So we're going to put 90 days because that is the limit for this agreement. Upon completion of a resulting transaction, whichever occurs first, that's the representation period, the non-exclusive right, unless paragraph 4B2 is checked, we'll get there, to represent buyer in acquiring real property or a manufactured home. So this is also required if your buyer is buying a manufactured home. So first, the next question, no pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements. So you want to make sure that the buyer hasn't already signed something with another agent. So that can easily be done by just asking, have you signed anything with another agent? Now, if they say yes, that's something you're going to have to talk through. You're going to need to see a copy of it and see if the representation period has expired, or if the terms, so whatever properties listed on that agreement, you want to make sure that they don't conflict. Whatever you're working with that buyer on does not conflict with the other agreement. So you do need to see a copy of it. So buyer acknowledges that buyer has not entered into a representation agreement with another broker and has no obligation to pay compensation to any other broker arising out of the acquisition of the property identified in paragraph 3, except identify other brokers and properties. So if they have, but it doesn't conflict, you can just simply list it here. So maybe he signed a buyer's representation agreement for a house, a particular property. You can just simply enter that information in here and it won't conflict because this one is for land. It's a completely different type of property. Okay. So you want to put here property to be acquired. Now I like to use as general of a description as possible. That way you won't have to redo it if something minor changes. So you want to put the location. Here is where you can put in cities or counties, price range or others. So you can make this as detailed or as general as you like. If this one is for the property that you've got listed only, you could put it here. You could just say this following specified property only and put the listing that he wants to place the offer on. Or you can attach a list of different properties. All right. So moving along, compensation to broker. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commission is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. And then an A is buyer agrees to pay broker as follows. And then it says 1 applies unless 2 or 3 is checked. Do not check both. So we have 3 options here. We have 1, it's a percentage of the acquisition price and it can be another flat fee. So you can put a percentage and your TC fee or whatever you want to put there. Or you can put a flat rate on number 2, or you can put number 3, pursuant to the compensation schedule attached, and then attach a compensation schedule. So in this case, we're just going to put a percentage. We're going to put 10% of the acquisition price and $425 TC fee. Okay, that's what we're going to put here. All right, broker right to compensation. Broker shall be entitled to compensation specified in paragraph 4A from buyer if during the representation period or any extension thereof, buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire any property described in paragraph 3, and the seller thereof completes the transaction or is prevented from doing so by default of buyer as follows. So what this is saying is that your buyer is obligated to pay you if the property he buys is up here and the compensation here is the amount that he's obligated to pay. All right, so if there's broker involvement on a non-exclusive representation, this agreement can be exclusive or non-exclusive. I always make it exclusive because unless there's a particular reason that you want to make it non-exclusive, it's always best to have an exclusive agreement. Compensation is payable only if there was broker involvement with the property. Broker involvement means any of the following. Buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. Broker showed the property to buyer virtually. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property. Or the property was introduced to buyer by broker or one for which the broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker, analyzing the property for the buyer specifically, or assisting buyer in the potential acquisition of the property, or communicating with the seller or the seller's agent regarding buyer's potential acquisition of the property. I know, a lot of words. What that means is that you as an agent can't say, hey, buyer, you owe me compensation if all that you did was send a copy of the listing to that particular buyer. You have to have some sort of involvement. Did you meet the buyer at the property and open it and show the property to the buyer? Did you uh, show the property virtually? You know, did you prepare the offer for the buyer? So there has to be some kind of involvement. It can't be as simple as, look, I sent you a picture of the property, now you own it. And that's in cases where the buyer went ahead and purchased the property with another agent. So you can't come in and say, hey, I sent you the picture first. That will not be enough to claim compensation. All right, number two. So these are the conditions that must happen before you have a right to compensation. So number two, buyer acquisition in an exclusive representation. This agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable. Broker will devote time and resources to assist buyer in finding and acquiring the property in the expectation of being paid for broker services. Broker is entitled to compensation if broker acquires property during the representation period with or without the broker involvement, even if another broker is entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. So what this is saying that if this is an exclusive representation agreement, then it doesn't matter if there was broker involvement or not, because you have an exclusive agreement with that buyer. That buyer is telling you, no matter who I close this property with, you are entitled to compensation because I signed an agreement with you saying that I will pay you. So this is another good reason why you want to have an exclusive agreement in case they go and they close the property with another agent. And then number three, buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to the buyer or who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described in paragraph 3. So so if the buyer has somebody else buy the property on his behalf, that would also, you know what, this is a little confusing. Buyer includes any person or entity other than broker related to buyer or who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described in paragraph 3. This looks like if the buyer has maybe his brother buy the property with him or for him, then you would be entitled to compensation. Okay, and then we go cancellation of buyer representation agreement. And this is the one thing that I really want you all to rely on in case your buyer has any qualms about signing an agreement with you. Just let him know that either side, the buyer or the broker, may cancel the agreement by just simply giving notice to the other. This agreement shall be terminated if paragraph 4B1 applies upon receipt of the notice, or you can enter a number of days after the receipt. Number 2, if paragraph 4B applies 30 days after receipt of the notice, broker shall nonetheless be entitled to compensation if during the representation period or any time specified in paragraph 4E, buyer acquires property for which there was broker involvement, provided broker delivers to buyer a written list of those properties for which there was broker involvement. The written list of broker involvement properties shall be delivered to buyer within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation. Before, during, and after the 5-day period, buyers advised to notify any other broker of broker's rights under this paragraph. So if, let's say, where's 4B1? So 4B1, 4B1, okay, yeah, broker involvement. Okay, so if the buyer says, look, this isn't working out for me, I want to cancel the agreement. So if the buyer provides written notice that he wants to end the contract, then you put, I don't know, if we said 10 here. So this agreement shall be terminated if it was a non-exclusive agreement and he sent you notice and 10 days has passed after notice, then the agreement is canceled. Okay. However, if it was an exclusive agreement, then 30 days after receipt of the notice. So if it was an exclusive agreement and buyer gives you notice, hey, I want to cancel, then it's canceled 30 days after the notice was given. Okay. And then after the termination of the agreement, you as the broker, if you were in a non-exclusive agreement, then you need to deliver to the buyer a list of all the properties where you had broker involvement. So any properties that you took that buyer to see within the time frame of this agreement, you're going to give those to the buyer. And if the buyer goes into an agreement with another agent, then he's got to list those properties on the new agreement so that the new agent is aware, hey, if you close on any of these properties, then compensation is owed to the previous agent. Does that make sense? I hope it does. But if you were in an exclusive agreement, neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to the expiration, except by mutual agreement. So if it's a non-exclusive agreement, it can be canceled by giving written notice to the other. However, if it's not, if it is exclusive, then neither party has the right to cancel. Okay? Tricky. All right. So D, accounting for payments to broker by others. If anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards the buyer's obligation to pay compensation. This is great because what this is saying is that if this agreement is for, let's say, on land, 5%, right? If it's a 5, or what did we put up here? Actually, we put 10% and 425. So let's say the seller says, look, I will compensate up to 5% for any buyer. Well, cool. So now the seller has covered 5% of this contract. Now what that means is the buyer is still obligated to pay 10%, but he's going to be credited that 5% from the seller. So the net effect would be 5% plus $425. So this is something you want to be clear with your buyer on. If anyone else, it covers buyer side compensation, that goes strictly to him, directly to him. And so you can also let him know that, look, I'm going to be asking for compensation for you. So that's another plus for him, because if you're asking for 10% and $425 and the seller says okay, that brings his net obligation to zero. Okay, so you want to just be very clear about what you're doing for him as the buyer. Okay, now it says if third-party payments received exceed the buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to broker or credited to buyer or other. So you have the choice here. So let's say the seller says, look, I'm willing to pay 12% towards the buyer's compensation. And this agreement's only for 10% and $425. So what do you do with the extra? So if you let this agreement default, in other words, you don't choose anything, then that amount goes back to you as the agent. But if you check this box, you can have it credited to the buyer, or you can check this box, other. So it can be, I don't know, taken off the purchase price or whatever you want it to do. Okay. Authorization to include commission in offer. So buyer authorized or does not authorize broker to include a term in the buyer's offer obligating the seller to pay broker directly or through escrow for any compensation that buyer owes broker. So if this defaults to buyer authorizing you to include a term in the buyer's offer. So you can say in the offer is for 70,000 for this land, plus I want you to pay 10% plus $425 towards the buyer's compensation. So if you check this box and the buyer does not authorize a type of offer like that, then you cannot ask for the buyer's compensation with the offer. So ideally, you would not want to check this box. All right, additional broker right to compensation. Broker shall be entitled to compensation provided for in paragraph 4A if within, and then you can put the calendar days, after expiration of the representation period or any extension thereof, if there is a cancellation after the effective date of the cancellation in paragraph 4C, buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement, provided prior to the expiration of this agreement or any extension thereof, or if there is a cancellation within the time specified in paragraph 4C. Broker delivers buyer a written notice of those properties which there was broker involvement. I know, a lot of words. What this is saying is this is just a safety clause. This is saying after the expiration of this agreement, do you want there to be a certain amount of time when this agreement still applies? So, 30 days is what I like to put for any safety clause. So next question, disclosure of anticipated payments to broker by others. If the broker, broker prior to writing an offer on a property, or if checked prior to showing the property, will disclose to the buyer if the amount of compensation broker expects to receive from a third party on that property by providing buyer with either a copy of the MLS listing showing the cooperating compensation offered to the broker, or a separate document such as an anticipated broker compensation disclosure. So this is just saying that if you know as the agent that the seller's offering compensation or something of that nature, or you've agreed to some sort of compensation, this is just saying that you will disclose to the buyer that fact. You're not going to keep it to yourself and just collect as much as you can. You need to disclose what you've already agreed to accept on different terms from the seller or other. Okay. So timing of compensation. The compensation is payable upon completion of any transaction. If acquisition is prevented by default of buyer, if acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than buyer. These are pretty much the same as any other compensation agreement. So there's nothing really different about that. Payment through escrow. Buyer hereby irrevocably assigns to broker the compensation provided for in this agreement from buyer's funds in escrow. So this is just letting the buyer know that these funds will be paid through escrow, and by signing this agreement, the buyer's already agreed to that happening. Okay, pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreement. If buyer acquires a property during the time buyer is obligated to compensate another broker, broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obligated to represent buyer in such transactions. So this is just saying if the buyer's already covered by another agreement, you're not obligated to represent him or collect for that representation. Okay. All right. So I think that's pretty much the meat and potatoes of it. If you have any questions, I just checked the CAR forms tutor, and they do not have the new forms in there just yet. So as far as getting any other help, the forms advisor no longer exists and the forms tutor is not quite ready. But you can always call paralegal. They will be happy to explain any of these terms with you or for you. Basically, it's an agreement. It's an agreement between you and your buyer that your buyers agreeing to pay for those services that you're providing. And quite honestly, I think this is a great move. I think it's a good conversation to have before you go through all the work that you go through when you represent a buyer. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And here we go, stop share. All right. And say goodbye and thank you for watching.